Well, welcome back to Montclair. We were just talking outside. The last time you were here with your film, The Lovers, you screened it at the Bellevue Theater as part of the Montclair Film Festival, so that was several years ago. It's so nice to have you back with this film. We loved it very much, so welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me back. Thank you Netflix for making this possible as well.
Awesome. So I'd like to start talking about the genesis of this project and sort of your development as a writer of scripts and screenplays that you've that you've turned into films. Over the years, I feel like you've really grown in your vision for working with actors and writing for actors, and you've been an incredible director of actors for a long time. But writing-wise, this seems a little bit more expansive to me than some of the other stuff. We've had two-handers in the past, or we've had, almost a one-hander with some tangential things going on as well. Maybe you could start by talking about the genesis of this and the decision to make a story about 3 women.
Yeah, so I think it's really true. I think most of my writing for a long time has been about characters that keep things inside, and it's a lot about silence and holding things back. And I wanted to go the opposite direction, which is something that I try to do with each film. And I was very excited and inspired by the idea of people that just spoke their feelings and spoke out, even if some things are being held back, but just really were forceful in themselves and how they presented themselves or how they wanted to be perceived. So the writing with that in mind started with this monologue that Katie does in the very beginning of the first moment of the film, and just having somebody lay out what was happening and then what their potential issues with who was. It all kind of came out of that first paragraph, and it was freeing in that way, where suddenly things were just being said, and that was exciting for me and something new, and really just a fun way of working. And then I think it was this contrast between these 3 sisters, especially the way that they come off at first and the way that they're presenting themselves, how they want to be perceived, and then the chance of breaking that down throughout the story in terms of who they actually are, or what they've been up to, was exciting again. This wasn't a challenge in that way that was a struggle. It was fun for me. I wanted to be around these people. And then once I realized halfway through writing that I was writing for these particular actors, it was great to picture them in these roles.
How did you figure out halfway through that the actors were the right actors for these characters? And when was the casting? Was that a mental casting, or did you have these relationships already and make a decision? Or?
Yeah, I made a film with Tracy Letts, who was married to Carrie Coon, and so I had a relationship with Carrie. Lizzie Olsen I had worked with a few times on a show of hers called Sorry for Your Loss. And then Natasha I had crossed paths with but never really had a chance to work with, but I really knew them more than anything through their work. And I think I was writing so much to rhythm more than anything, which was just trying to hear how things, and I was trying to write in the way that it would be shot. So somebody would come and say something, I'd go to them with this the staccato that was really, and then I think that led into just me feeling, oh, that feels like Carrie's rhythm to a certain degree, or that Natasha could pull that off, or Lizzie could do this, and then it became oh, I'm writing for them, and at least I know how to reach them. And Javon Adepo, I also realized I was writing for, who plays Benji, Rachel's boyfriend. And so because I had a relationship with each of them, it definitely became one of these things, once I get this to a good pass, that I would send it directly to them before anything.
Fingers crossed when they read it.
Yeah. It's always fingers crossed.
Right, exactly. So the other thing here, of course, is the story itself, and your work always has a personal touch, especially Mama's Man, which is the first film that I was fortunate to program, but all of it really has a personal touch to it. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about plot-wise and story-wise, characters aside, and I want to come back to the characters in relationship to the story, but the story itself, this idea of sort of grieving together, coming together to deal with the imminence of loss as a family, maybe a little bit about that and what inspired you from that writing.
Yeah. I lived in Los Angeles with my wife for many, many years, but grew up in New York City, and I got to a certain, my parents hit a certain age where it became very clear that it was time to move back here to be helpful alongside my sister, and we moved back really kind of in the midst of pandemic, and it was, I'd go out for these walks in the morning where the streets were still empty and people were definitely had gone through something intense all over. And I was incredibly inspired by what I was seeing in the streets. I was like, even though all of it was tough and horrible and terrible, I was seeing kind of beautiful people and hearing conversations and feeling this kind of, there was some type of just celebration of life, of us living, whoever was making it through, within the struggle, within this terrible struggle that I found that I wanted to comment on or just appreciate. And also just dealing with this window with my own folks who, there was clear that I had a certain time that I could tell the story before being very involved in their health would make it not possible to tell this story. So a lot of this film comes from, yes, some experiences, but also a lot of fears and hopes for dealing with my parents eventually passing.
And the ability to write for three women, instead of just being yourself talking about that situation, you're now able to refract that into different characters. I'm wondering if each character in the film represented a different voice or a different part of yourself. I know you're writing for the actors themselves, but was that a liberating process as well in terms of processing your own feelings about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I see myself in everybody. Like I see myself and I've shifted through, oh, I've been that person, or I'm this person or that person. So that hasn't been, I think that they're very separate in a certain way, but I do feel, I did find myself very quickly into each of them.
How do you work with the actors as a director? So you've written the script, you've gotten them on board. Do you have rehearsal time? This feels very much like a chamber drama in a lot of ways that would, and because you mentioned the rat-a-tat rhythm and the staccato of the script, that there's got to be some very specific direction going on with the actors and voice.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that process and sort of bringing it together before you shot?
Well, I would say throughout making every film, actors are very, very different from each other, and how they approach the work is very different. So the way that Deborah Winger or Tracy Letts or John Riley or any of these people are so particular on the way, so you're constantly shifting in terms of like, oh, that person responds to this, or this person doesn't respond to that way. And so for sure with these three, they're very different the way that they approach, and I try to shift to that. At the same time, they're all were excited to work with it. They're all fans of each other. So I think a big part of the pull was not only the material and us getting a chance to work with each other, but they really wanted to be around each other and see how each other worked as well. And so in terms of preparation, like, again, it was like very, like with Lizzie, like I went out to LA and we watched movies together and talked a lot about things that Christina could have come from and just had a different experience. With Carrie, it was really just like, she saw everything on the page and we had conversations to a degree, but it wasn't, and then with Natasha, we also like had different type of, like more walking through the city talking. And then we had a good period of time, maybe like a week, where we were inside one of the apartments, not totally the apartment that we're shooting, but in that building, and we're able to just be left alone and start talking, going through scenes and feeling things out and feeling each other out. I would say that my wife, who's a producer on this, is also a costumer, and she's the person that reads the first script, and by the time that I'm shooting, the clothes are already starting to get formed. So I think that's always been a way in, that's been like a really fast and easy way in, is that she has such a beautiful eye in terms of grounding it in the world that I'm hoping for, that the actors usually respond to her choice there, which gives us like an even world that we've all decided that, okay, this exists in this world.
And you allow them the freedom to set that for you, like as a ensemble, or do you do that together?
Diaz and I do it really close together, and then like that point, then they come in, but there's already been a selection, and we're like, it's really, she and I have made okay, this, and in fact, it was us two that went out looking for apartments, so we just went through, going through neighborhoods, leaving flyers, and just trying to find, because I had a really specific idea of a certain type of working class apartment that also was gold in New York, that had space, and an idea that was rent stabilized. Like, that is the family treasure. So that was really important to me, that it had history, it also had a beautiful view, it had enough area for them. It was something that people would want to hold on to, especially if you're in the city.
And so you've always been, I think, a really kind of magical director in terms of mise en scène within, sorry to be French, pretentious sounding, in terms of physical space in a very limited spatial environment, because you've worked in low budget films before. You shot Mama's, if you haven't seen Mama's Man, I highly recommend it, but it's shot in your childhood home that your parents, apartment that your parents still occupy in, is it Tribeca? Or, yeah. So you've always had a real eye for homes and physical spaces and creating drama within these very tight physical spaces. And I'm wondering, in this film in particular, I feel like the geometry of this apartment continues to unfold for me as I watch the film. Like I did, like this door here, that hallway there, leading to there, and that's where it is in relation to the kitchen. Like I'm trying to put the place together in my head, and it's very much almost like a cubist. That's a dumb analogy, but way of doing it, because you're seeing each shot differently. Working with your cinematographer and setting up these shots and creating that much possibility in such a limited space. I'm wondering if you could talk about the process when you found this apartment. How do you put together a shooting plan with these actors in that space?
Yeah, so it's not usually like this, but I had such a specific idea of how I wanted this to be cut that I wound up doing kind of a color-coded version of what lines were, do we need to see this person or see that person, so that I could just feel the rhythm of how time moved. Because I think even though it's a one area place, the difference that I wanted to take away from it being like a play was that I felt that when you're facing somebody's death, time moves in a very specific way that's not like real time, that's not like real life, where suddenly you're talking about like, hey, I'm gonna go get a coffee, and then the coffee's in your hand, or you wanna get a coffee and it takes like 5 hours, and then there's this shift of going from dreading what's about to happen to realizing it's gonna happen to waiting till it's gonna happen, and all that had to be compact in a certain way that in this one place. And so the jumps in framing were really important to me, not only the jumps between scenes, but also how are we going to isolate each other, when are they going to come together? Like Rachel and Katie don't share a frame, I think, until like an hour into it. So that was something that Sam Levy and I, the cinematographer, discussed a lot. Like when are people actually starting to connect with each other? And the same thing with the space that you said, which was how do we hopefully like reveal this space as these characters are revealing themselves, as certain things are being shed, so we realize, oh, actually that's connected to that, and that's connected to that. And so starting with this very specific kind of Katie against a white wall, which could be like a casting, it could be like an audition room, it could be anything, and then realizing, okay, somebody's crossed the street, across the table, but that looks very different to that. So playing with space between was essential. And then there was that strange wall that's like in the living room that's like 2 inches thick, which is something that I think it's something amazing, that because this was a like a co-op that was built for workers, right? It was that, and so somebody back in the 30s or 40s came up with this thin wall that gave separation space, which wasn't really creating a wall, like a real wall. So they were figuring out how to give a family space, which I thought was beautiful. And I think one of the things that drew us to this particular apartment is that most apartments in there had broken down that wall to make it a much bigger open space. But I liked how it already was framed specifically in this home.
So did you went in there and blocked that ahead of the shoot, or were you, I mean, you did a lot of...
Yeah, we emptied out. It was a young couple that had moved in. We emptied out all their stuff, so everything was painted and dressed to kind of give it this history that it really had within the soul of it, but was no longer there.
And then the father's room operates as a sort of ominous void in the home as well, and that people are sort of moving in and out of, and we don't really see them in processing in that space ever. I mean, they come in and they go out, but we don't ever know this private sort of unknown area of the house. I'm wondering if you could talk a little about that.
Yeah, I mean, the father emerging from their room was as much a surprise to me. Like when I was, like I was writing and I was like, oh, here he is. Like, this is happening. This is really happening. Oh no, this is not really happening. So I went through that. I felt that. I wasn't interested in going to that room because I find dying scenes usually pretty insulting, especially going through it. When I've gone through it in real life, I've been felt like generally very lied to in films, and so which I think that kind of comes up in the conversation in the speech here. So the idea of going into this room and seeing somebody die was something I didn't want to do. And at the same time, I felt like this idea of never seeing the father, and this is only in retrospect, because I don't really pre-plan these things. Like, I follow my instincts and I go for it generally without so much questioning, and I didn't question it. But looking back at it now, I felt like, oh, I could have a really neat, independent film if you never see the father, which kind of sets up rules and just follows those rules and draws within those lines, or there's this thing that suddenly takes a real chance, and it's either going to be for some people or it's not going to be for some people, but it's something that I hadn't seen and I didn't expect and I didn't know, and that's what I look for in films.
Yeah. And so, talk to me a little about writing for that character and casting for that character, because I think it is a surprising. No, it's also surprising, I think, the relationship that we see between them, in those moments, because it's all led up to this, and it's like, oh, this is completely not what I was expecting in terms of their interpersonal relationships with him.
Yeah.
It totally shifts sort of our perception of the women as well.
I think it's wishful fulfillment for me, this idea that we get this moment to say all these things that we may have wanted to say, and that he gets a chance to say these things, and that these girls get to hear these things. It's playing with this idea that you can do that, like that. Yes, it didn't happen, but it did happen for us, and we got to hear these things, and we got to hear the response, and it becomes true because we went through the experience, and it could be part of their fantasy as well as his, and so they get to live with this fantasy. So that's really what it was. The writing of it was like, oh, if somebody got a chance to really get to say, hey, you don't fully know me. You have an idea of who I am. You have an idea, but here's something that maybe you didn't know about me, and this is some regrets that I have, and I'm sorry, and I love you, and these things that generally don't happen so simply.
You've always been such a great filmmaker about New York City. Natasha's character finds refuge out of the house in New York instead of being sort of coming home to find refuge. She's got a room, but she's going out into the city to be who she is and to escape sort of the home. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about shooting those scenes with her on the street. She's there's not an actor working today who reminds me more of like walking down the street of New York, Manhattan, than Natasha Lyonne. Like, she's the perfect person for that.
Yeah, it's true. Well, so when I finished the script and I reached out to them, to the three of them and Jovan, and I said I was going to send them the script. I printed it out and I sent them hard copies, and I said, so I'm sending you a hard copy because I want this to exist kind of outside of the computer, and I just want this to be a different type of, I want to approach this in a different way. I promised I'm going to be shooting this in New York City, in a real apartment, and on film. And just trying to, and that we'd be partners in this, like we really would be partners. Like I hadn't gone out to anybody else. Like we'd start with us being the group and figure out who's the right, how to put this all together afterwards. But it would stay with us always together. So that carried through, and I also tried as best as I could to shoot in order. So that scene one, that shot, the first shot was Carrie Coon against that wall, and just her going out and saying this thing, this monologue, and then that having an effect on, I think, not only the other actors, but the crew. It had this ripple effect. So then everything was pretty much actual, so that downstairs was straight downstairs from the apartment. That is the courtyard of that place. The walk to the wee shop is very close to there. Everything, like, I was trying to make sure that the city that I grew up in was represented in a way that felt very tangible. And it's not that I'm like stuck, like I shot, French Exit took place in New York City, but we shot that in Montreal. I'm totally fine with the fantasy of things. But in this case, one of the things that I was responding about coming back to New York after being gone for so long was the fixture, what remained, what was solid there. It stopped being this thing like, oh, that restaurant's gone, this place is gone. It was like, oh, that's still standing, that's still standing. You can't, if I look this way, that's how I know it.
And so you just mentioned that you shot this on film, which today is an amazing accomplishment. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that from a visual point of view, because texturally, obviously you shoot a film of, in New York City, in an apartment in interiors with these women. It calls back, many classic films that are about similar themes. And I'm wondering visually if there was something you were going for there with shooting on film, or if that was, that sort of historical texture that we love so much. I mean, it's awesome, but I mean, also there's a purpose behind it.
Yeah, I felt like there was an area, like there was a time even in the 90s that these films were quite common, that were pretty small, that were about human beings, that were just in terms of they're connecting with each other or not connecting with each other. So I like that, besides all the films of the 70s that, of course, will be kind of this incredible thing to aim for. Jesus, Jenna Rollins. So there's people that have left masterpieces, but then there's also people that have just have this trail that you're just trying to hopefully have a conversation with some of those work. And so definitely shooting on film kind of automatically has this conversation, especially because it's become so rare to shoot film. But in our case, it's also film is beautiful, and we knew we weren't going to be lighting a lot, so we wanted to trust that rather than the technology to capture something, and also that we knew that we didn't have a lot of time, that we weren't going to shoot this over a lot of time. So shooting on film forced us to be very, very particular about when we shot and how we shot. And so everything was planned in a way that I really wanted to, rather than coming from a situation where we're shooting video and you potentially could shoot with 2 or 3 cameras at the same time, so that you have the scene, but you're going to figure out what the angle is ultimately the scene later on the edit. I wanted to know that before going, and especially since I was going to cut this, I wanted to shoot it in the way that I understood, since I was going to be cutting this by myself.
Yeah, and maybe you could mention some of the films that you looked at or were inspired by for this movie? We mentioned the savages outside.
Oh yeah, well, Savage is a Tamara Jenkins film that is
Has
about a
everyone seen
brother.
that with Philip Seymour Hoffman and, yeah.
So-
Laura Linney?
You know, the connection is, well, I'm a fan of hers for sure, but also it was just a film about a brother and sister dealing with their father, and it just gave me some template of this type of story and how a family, how siblings, how family can come together or not come together. And I found as I was starting to experience things like, oh, that film was very true, and it was just cool that existed. In terms of like influences that I showed them, it was really all over the place. And again, it was like pretty different according to the person. How Harley I went to SUNY Purchase, and how Harley went to Purchase before me. I realized rewatching his films during the pandemic how much of an influence. So like that's the idea of shooting with rhythm and having people, even though it's like a very different degree, but it's so purposeful and it's so risky what he did and what he does. That was inspiring. So I wound up showing to I think all three of them, like Trust, and I think it was Trust, maybe something else. We talked about Michael Romer. I already had a copy of this film, Plot Against Harry, which is now out, which is this incredible independent film, like, behind. But also, like, the humor and the drama is this strange place that I wanted this film to exist in. There was a bunch of Eric Lemire films, which I think was a great just the idea of people conversing and talking and moving through, and the stakes being on one side very high, on the other side being stakes that were very common. I'm trying to think of some other ones.
So did you like give them a DVD and say, go watch this, or did you like get a theater? Because I read a really great book about M. Night Shyamalan. It's a terrible book. His was making a film, and he rented out a theater to show everyone The Wizard of Oz on the cast and crew. They had a whole thing, and literally no one went. And it was like this devastating thing for him, like in the preparation for making a movie, like the crew didn't show up, the cast didn't show up, and he was grappling with that. I'm like, how do they do that today? Like, are you renting theater? You're sending a DVD and say, take a look? Or...
Yeah, I mean, with Lizzie, I definitely went with a stack of DVDs. Actually, Natasha and I met because she rented out a theater. The first time we met, she rented out a theater for her birthday to show King of Comedy, which is like a film that I go to probably on a yearly basis. So the fact that we had already met, I think that was a film that she loved so much that she wanted to screen to as a birthday party. Like, we already connected in that way. And then Carrie and Tracy have like this insane, I think they have 5,000 Blu-rays or something. So they're movie watchers. So it was more with Carrie, she's just seeing everything, and so I don't know if we've gotten to that conversation. But a lot of the watching movies for me is for me, and I go, oh wow, that's amazing. I want to try for that. I want to go for that. I want some of that.
So what's next for this film? I mentioned on the intro that we're going to be bringing it back here to the Claridge for a theatrical run for a week, and then Netflix.
Yeah. September 6th, it starts coming out in theaters and all throughout this country, and I know in the UK and Ireland and stuff like that, so I'm starting to do a lot of traveling for that. And then September 20th, it's available on Netflix around the world.
Which is really exciting.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Any, I guess, final thoughts that you had on the road here?
Also just a note too,
yeah.
if people are curious about past work, that all
Yes.
starts, a lot of my past work starts streaming on Criterion September 1st, so you can see most of the films on Criterion channel.
I will be posting on the Montclair Film social media channels. We'll get a playlist. They have like a playlist of like films by Azazel Jacobs on the Criterion channel.
Yeah, starting to come first, yeah.
All right.
So, Mama's Band, Terry, The Lovers.
Show me all of those.
Yeah.
I showed 3 out of the 4. That's great. Okay, cool. Well, I'm so grateful to you for coming tonight and bringing this film to us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.